All right, so 401, we will go ahead and get started. Hi and welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, Ms. Monica Belton. Ms. Belton is an activist and a social worker who has been working with kids for 19 years, and she holds a master's degree in social work from Arizona State University. She is the founder of the nonprofit Reset, which stands for Resilient Experiences for Children Exposed to Trauma, and today she will be speaking on the impact of racial trauma on youth. Before we begin, I want to clarify that there's going to be roughly 10 to 15 minutes towards the end of question and answer, so feel free to drop your questions as we go. Okay, Ms. Belton, go ahead and take it away whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Well, first, I just want to introduce myself. Thank you for that introduction. My name is Monica Belton. I am a social worker, and I'm also a certified trauma professional in education. So specifically, what I want to do in these lessons and these conversations is not to try to educate people on stuff that they don't know about or don't understand or get a further understanding. I want to instigate conversation. When we talk about trauma, and we talk specifically about racial trauma, we want to have conversations, we want to develop language so that people who are affected by trauma can tell their stories. That is part of the recovery and part of the process. And the only goal of this conversation for me is to have people start to be able to really think about impacts of daily actions and things that we see as a part of our lives every day. Okay, next slide. So I am not an expert on racism. I have done lots of research and lots of studying, but just to point out that a lot of the stuff that I talk about today is from a variety of resources. But most importantly, there's a book by Sheila Wise Rowe called Healing Racial Trauma. And she speaks a lot to the specifics of racial trauma and historical manifestations of that. Also, we're going to talk a little bit today about ACEs, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And it was developed after a research study in the 1990s by Dr. Vincent Folletti and Dr. Robert Anda. And they worked for the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. And they conducted a study of 17,000 medium-sized population at the time, but it's still one of the largest studies of its kind that studied the effects of trauma on youth and outcomes later in life. And then some of the things that we talk about today are going to be from an article, a very prominent article called The Impact of Racial Trauma by Dr. Walter Howard Jr. Next slide. Okay. So I want to start out with a quote. James Baldwin has got to be my favorite activist by far. And it's not just for the eloquent way that he speaks, but because of his intersectionality and what he represents and his plight in racial activism. So this quote says, "It comes as a great shock that the flag that you pledge allegiance to has not pledged allegiance to you." And he wrote that back in the summer of 1968. And I don't think it's any more relevant then than it is today. And I think that is what this whole, for lack of a better word, revolution is about. It is about the fact that people are waking up to understand that the country we live in is not the same country that they thought it was. And it is coming as a shock to a lot of people, especially white people, in the essence that realizing that things that they dismissed before as problems of the Black population are actually problems for everyone in this country. And the next one is by Leela Watson, who's actually an Indigenous Australian activist. And what she says is, if you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you recognize that your liberation and mine are bound up together, we can walk together. And I think that speaks specifically to our allies, because if we realize now that what makes our society move forward, if we always have someone who's being oppressed, we have to have oppressors. And I think the realization that people don't want to be oppressors and they want to be proud of where we live, then we have to do that together. So throughout this presentation, you're going to hear me refer to myself a lot, me, myself, my people. So I want to know that my ethnicities I identify with are Black and Indigenous. I am part Puerto Rican, and what's the new, I guess another part of this revolution, even though it's something that we have always known, is that people who identify historically as Hispanic or Latino are actually Indigenous people. And we were colonized by people from Latin-speaking countries and from people from Spain. And that's really a whole other topic, but just to let you know that that's what I identify with, the ethnicities that I identify with, and that I'll be talking about in my talk today. Okay, so when I work with children, when I work with families, this is absolutely my favorite model of trauma recovery. It's developed by Dr. Odela Gertel-Craybill, and she actually has an active practice. She is in Silver Springs, Maryland, and her practice is the Expressive Trauma Integration Practice. But I find this model to be the simplest explanation of trauma recovery. And I like it because when I can check in with the children that I work with and their parents, we can talk about what happened with your number 2. Are we still at number 3 today? What can we do at number 4? So let me walk through this model with you really quickly, and then I'll tell you why some of them are crossed out. So the routine is your daily life. You're experiencing, let's just say, for lack of better terms, a normal, healthy childhood. Specifically, with being Black in America, that routine may never be normal and healthy. What we know now is that a larger proportion of Black mothers die in childbirth than any other race in this country. In addition to that, most Black people can identify being acknowledged because of their race, so facing racism, or feeling ostracized because of their race by the time they're 5 years old. So that routine doesn't always last very long for people of color in this country. Number 2 is the event. There's different types of trauma. There's complex trauma and simple trauma. When we're talking specifically about racism, it is, with no doubt, a complex trauma because it happens in various ways over extended periods of time. And we're going to get a little more into that. But I really want to point out the fact that, again, for other types of trauma, the event can be a very singular thing. For abuse and neglect in the home, it could be very constant and part of someone's life. But as far as racism is concerned, it's pervasive. So the next step is withdrawal. And the withdrawal has 2 aspects to it. The first aspect is really being able to shut down. So after the event, and we'll talk a little bit about the physiology of that, but after the event occurs, a person's body goes into a shutdown mode. And in that mode, that is when depression can develop, anxiety, other types of mental health disorders, relational dysfunction. There's another side to withdrawal, and that side is the recovery. When the mindfulness happens, the education happens. I have to go back one. Yes, the mindfulness happens, the education happens, and then when you're reaching that point where you are then stimulated into coming out of your withdrawal, that's when we go into awareness. So those are crossed out, the next 3 steps: awareness, action, and integration. Because holistically speaking, a person who is facing racial trauma cannot leave withdrawal because the society that we live in is not a safe place to do that. With that being said, there are several aspects occurring specifically now that can help in that healing, that can bring somebody out of withdrawal into awareness. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But definitely, if it's not a safe place, people cannot continue with the recovery of trauma. So we're talking about the event happening, somebody going into withdrawal. So you have this pervasive traumatic history, and then continued racism. But then on top of that, when your racism is not validated, it becomes even more isolating and more traumatizing, and so therefore even harder to recover. Okay, next slide. So racial trauma is real. Racial trauma is not included in the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. Most people who display symptomology of trauma are treated as people with post-traumatic stress disorder. And we're going to talk in a little bit about systemic racism, but in my opinion, that's completely why racial trauma is not in the DSM-4, because it's not being acknowledged in the way that it should be. Now, racial trauma in itself has been heavily researched since the early 1900s. As early as 1908, there was an article written about the impacts of sustained slavery on the population of Black people in America. Even though slavery had been abolished, there were still residual effects of that, clearly, and now up until today. But it was being studied as a branch of science even back then. But even now, it's still not in our DSM-4, DSM-5 now. And so I think that lends a lot to think about as to why that's not being acknowledged and why we know that it's real. So we have new research now that further explains the point that racial trauma causes physical and mental health problems of people of color, more specifically, the Black and Indigenous people of North America. I know that, and I just learned, and I already knew the term BIPOC, but I just learned that it was really just started to elevate as a term only back in May of 2020. And BIPOC stands for Black and Indigenous People of Color. It stands there to distinguish between the experiences of people of color and Black and Indigenous people. Black and Indigenous people hadn't been populations that experience similar branches of almost intentional extermination. Not to say that other people of color have not, but there is a distinction there between those two things. And so I definitely, that was really interesting that this started to become an acknowledgement. Okay, next slide. All right, so I've seen many different definitions of racism, and I've seen many people arguing different definitions of racism. This is my favorite one because it explains to me exactly what it is. Racism is a normal practice. It's not a mindset, it's not a thought, it's not a feeling. It's a normal practice of operating that benefits the elites and working class white people by racializing groups based on ethnicities and cultures. That's what racism is. When I first started studying race, realizing for a long time, I thought there was some type of biological indications between the races because of things like sickle cell disorder only happening to African Americans and things like that. But the reality is that there are some white people who have sickle cell. So it's not, there really is no biological difference. The differences between what ethnicities and cultures are their biological adaptations to wherever their ancestors are from. That is why people look different. And that's it. Then when you put on top of that how the different cultures emerged, then you have different ethnicities. And so racism is then the practice of separating those different ethnicities into different groups so that one group has the power. And that is the working definition of racism that I work with. And I'm going to explain some of these other ones with the same rhetoric as that. So I'm just breaking these down. I'm not sure who's here and what part of the journey they're on, but I think it's important to review different types of racism so that everybody understands how pervasive it is. It's not just one thing. So interpersonal racism is discrimination or attacks on a person, either by other people or by institution. So it's very personal. Sometimes it can be a very intimate intrusion. So when someone's called the N-word or other racial slurs, when someone attacks someone's character just because of the color of their skin, when institutions act discriminatorily towards a person of color. When it happens to a person, yes, it affects the larger group, people who find out about it, but the interpersonal racism is when you directly are violated because of the way that you look, or the culture you come from, or the ethnicity that you identify with. Systemic racism is different than institutional instructional racism, and this is how. So systemic racism is the practice and the ideology. So when we're talking about people who have the power and the money, who have an ideology, a mindset that they teach and reinforce to keep certain people oppressed, that is systemic racism. When that mindset and that practice is written into law and policy, that is institutional, and then therefore structural racism. So let's take like slavery, for example. Slavery, of course, is against the law, but for a long time after the emancipation, the systemic racism, the practice of slavery still continued. So, and other things we're talking about, let's talk about Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws in the South were very much policies that were written to discriminate against people of color. And even if those policies weren't there after they were ruled to be unconstitutional, you still had the systemic racism, which was when Black people were not allowed to enter certain places and enjoy the same spaces as white people. So that's the difference between those two. Public space racism. So this, I think, when we're talking specifically about the murder of unarmed Black men, this is the first thing that comes to mind to me. Because public space racism is when you are outside of your house, living in the country that you live in, and you don't feel safe because of the color of your skin. So if we're talking, even now today, where there are certain places in the South where it is very clear that Black people are not welcome. That's an example of public space racism. I can't walk down the street. And now, with the exposure of all the videos and audios that we're hearing of these murders of unarmed Black men and women in public spaces, that public space becomes even more restricted when you're a person of color and you don't feel safe driving down the street, running down the street, no matter where you are, from Michigan to Maine to California to Florida. We hear things that are happening in public spaces where people may have felt safe in the past, but now are afraid to go. When you're driving down the street, going for a jog, even apparently sleeping in your own bedroom, does not feel like a safe space. So that public space racism is, again, pervasive. And now with the wonder and power of social media and video, it's even more pervasive than we ever would have thought. Spatial racism is different than public space because it's definitely more, again, of the ideology. So when you're facing spatial racism, you're looking at institutions that don't make space for Black and Indigenous people. So traditionally, white-only country clubs, organizations. Not so long ago, corporate America used to not make spaces for them. In government, in our local government, school boards, all the way up to Senate and Congress, there used to be very much an unspoken understanding that Black people don't belong there. And that's what spatial racism is about. And the thing about spatial racism is that many people have fought long and hard to make spaces for Black people to come to these spaces, to come sit at the table. And just quick shout out to everyone who's able to do that, because it's not the same place where we were not even 10 years ago. The activism that we see today as far as making spaces more available to Black people. So environmental racism is the next one. And the first thing that comes to mind when I think about environmental racism are Indigenous Native American reservations. So back when Native Americans were given a place to live in their own country, they were given the most unfertile, unfarmable lands ever. And that was a way of, again, oppressing people, putting them in a space with no resources, and allowing them to only have this space. Another thing that comes to mind is the Flint, Michigan water crisis, where we have a situation where people of power have the ability to fix the resources in an area, and people, the oppressed people who are trying to get that to happen simply cannot. That is a strict enforcement of environmental racism, that you are not allowed to have this resource. Very specifically drawn out as to where this can and cannot, where you can and cannot be and utilize. Internalized racism is when we start to have feelings of self-hatred. And that's also in colorism and defensive othering. So specifically with internalized racism, one begins to kind of accept the fact that of their place in the country. I wrote an article about young Black men and how it might feel to walk into a room knowing that everyone in that room thinks that you are ugly, violent, and dumb, because that is what you have been taught. And when I do this talk with other small groups, we talk about that and how people have had that experience. That is not something I'm making up. When Black people are taught to be, that they are those things by social media, by movies, by books, by things that we learn in school, it takes a lot to correct that. That is a battle for Black parents, and now, thankfully, our allies too, to have to correct that mindset in our young people. That message that we're constantly getting, that Black people are violent. They are not as smart as other people, and they don't have the same Eurocentric features that are so valued in this country. And it's really, really difficult to do that. So imagine even being a young person and experiencing something like that. Somebody brought up yesterday while I was doing this talk, and I'm not sure how many people have seen this video, but it's of some young people, and they were, doing a psychological testing, so they were in this isolated room with a Black baby doll and a white baby doll. And these kids were as young as 4 years old, and the researcher asked them to pick out which one was the ugly doll. And both races, Black and white, picked the Black doll. Which one is the naughty baby? Again, both races picked out the Black child. And it's really interesting because there's so much that has to do with historical racism that we're going to talk about in a second, that has to do with how that is passed on, how that mindset can be passed on to someone so young. Colorism is another form of racism that unfortunately has been practiced all over the world, not just America. But I do want to talk about it, how it's practiced today, because it's still something that people with lighter skin are socially accepted more than people with darker skin. And that is a fault of many things, of colonization, of course, for one, but it's constantly, even by young Black people today, gets reiterated as a real thing, as if someone's skin tone has something to do with their character or their intellect. So that's a whole other layer of racism that people with darker skin, more melanin, have to deal with. And defensive othering. So defensive othering is another form of self-hatred, but it's when someone they want to be part of the dominant group. So in this situation, the white people. And so they will actually engage in racial jokes or discriminatory practices because they have become that accepted Black friend. They have become that accepted that safe Black person at work. You have become that person, and so in order to defend that position, you then will kind of adapt the racial mindset of the dominant culture and go along with that because it's safe. Okay, next slide. So in addition to different forms of racism, there's very specific types of racial trauma. So racial trauma is the actual physical and psychological symptoms that people of color often experience after a stressful racial incident. And as we talked about before, that racial incident can happen very, very early in life. So these personal or vicarious incidences happen repeatedly, and they cause racial trauma to accumulate, which contributes to chronic stress. So that is what trauma is. It is chronic stress. And so this is a couple of different types of trauma that Black people experience, and historical trauma being up there as, and it's interesting because historical trauma gets passed down in our systems and practices in the country. So we're still suffering from the effects of slavery that happened 401 years ago. Of course, we're still, as a culture and a society, still correcting ourselves from that. But then transgenerational trauma is a different type of historical trauma. So that has two parts to it. So transgenerational trauma talks first about epigenetics. And epigenetics is a science, and there's a lot of current research about how someone's actual DNA gets manipulated because of trauma, and memories of racial trauma are actually passed down from generation to generation. The other part of transgenerational trauma comes through storytelling and practices. So I have people who have told me things like understanding that when you are walking down the street and you are in a predominantly white environment, and you have heard stories about people in your family that have experienced direct physical racism or interpersonal racism because of the way they looked, the way they presented themselves. So that's when you really want to be able to protect yourself. And so you put on your smile and you straighten your hair and you wear high heels, you adapt characteristics of the dominant culture because you're afraid of what might happen. Not because maybe you have experience or not, but just because of the transgenerational trauma of the stories that you have heard from people that in your family who you identify with that has happened to them. Personal trauma, of course, is what happens when you personally are affected by a racial incident or discrimination. The physical trauma is what happens to you when you are attacked, usually assaulted, simply because of the color of your skin. That's a little different than being verbally attacked, but it definitely, as we all know, can be just as aggressive and painful. Vicarious trauma. After that, George, and people often ask me, like, what is it? What is it now about our white allies that they didn't realize any of this stuff was going on before? And I try to explain to people, it's not because racism and police brutality specifically, I think was seen as very much a Black problem. Because if you're white in this country, you can very well never have to deal with any of this. You could not have any Black people in your family. You could never have any Black friends or coworkers that you have to have these conversations with, or coworkers that are comfortable having this conversation with you. And so really not knowing, and there have been other videos, but none of them have been circulated and had the impact of watching a white man kneeling on a Black man's neck until we watched him die. And when I have not spoken to a Black person who says that they did not see their father on that ground, or their child on that ground, or their uncle, or their son. And that is vicarious trauma. So the vicarious trauma, we talked, just finishing up talking about that. And again, the research that came along with that goes along with the fact that we know that people's brains and people metabolically react to seeing events of trauma. Gaslighting is a term that was coined back in the 1930s from a movie called Gaslight, where a man actually tried to convince his wife that she was crazy. And the way that refers to racial trauma is when someone experiences racism sometimes you really have to take a step back and get validation. Did that really just happen to me? And often it's dismissed by people saying, it was just a joke, you're being too sensitive, that's a really nice person, I'm sure they didn't mean it like that. And that's what gaslighting is. Gaslighting really makes you think that maybe this is not happening. So when you are experiencing discrimination and racism, and then nobody validates it, again, the mental impacts of that are extraordinary. And the next type of racial trauma is moral injury. And this speaks a lot, I don't think, not just to Black people in America, but also to allies, because we're talking about things that we morally know are unjust. So when we see killings happen and no one's been held accountable for them, when we see laws passed that are unjust and inhumane, and it takes 20, 30 years for them to reverse laws, that incessantly we know is wrong. It is wrong to make human beings go to court to fight to be treated like human beings. But when we see this happen, it causes moral injury. It actually impacts us so deeply that we question sometimes our own reality, we question our faith, and it's really impactful in that level. So I have a whole nother talk about microaggressions. I've heard microaggressions described as death by 1,000 paper cuts, and I couldn't say it better myself. So microaggressions are what occur by their slights, their slurs, their racial jokes, their stereotypes that people overhear or they hear directly told to them that cause people harm. And especially when they're not confronted, they become even more painful. And so, again, another form of racial trauma. Okay, we can go to the next slide. All right, so we're talking about racial trauma. We talked about what it was. We talked about how it manifests for people in this country, Black people in this country. So right now, I want to get into a little bit about the science of what that does to a young person's body. So trauma is the co-regulation system when it becomes dysregulated by chronic stress. So a couple of things happen. So our limbic system, part of our limbic system is our amygdala and our motor cortex. So our amygdala is the part of our brain that is on the lookout, right? So we're searching for what is safe, what is not safe, when can I relax, and that's that. Our amygdala then signals to our motor cortex what it should be doing. Can we laugh now? Should we be crying? Should we be looking for safety? So in a normal, in terms of racial trauma, so for, let's say, a white person who is living in this country, they could, excluding any other type of trauma, they could have a very well-functioning limbic system. But when racism occurs to a person of color, and it occurs repeatedly, and as we've just learned, it can occur repeatedly every day, several times a day, that system becomes overwhelmed. The amygdala is always activated, sending off alarms in our body, particularly releasing in our brains cortisol, which is, I'm going to get down to that, but it actually causes too much cortisol, can actually cause a toxicity in our blood. So when our amygdala says danger, our motor cortex is activated. Then our reticular activating system goes into overdrive. So that is our neurons that shoot all over our brains saying we need to do something. Something needs to happen right now. We are overwhelmed. And imagine if you were a Black person in America having this reticular activating system triggered every moment that you're awake, maybe even when you're sleeping. So then your autonomic nervous system kicks in. Autonomic nervous system has two parts. The first part being the sympathetic nervous system. So you often hear people say that people, when they see danger, they flight or fight or freeze. but that's actually not the way our sympathetic nervous system works. When our bodies are triggered, we're overwhelmed, the first thing we try to do is flight. We try to get ourselves out of the situation. So if we are, again, talking specifically about racial trauma, if we are in a heated incident at the time, we just faced a microaggression, or we felt violated by a public space, we try to get out of that area. That is what our body looks for, an escape. Sometimes that could be, if you can't physically move, sometimes that could be crying, or that could be folding your arms, or those can be all of those things that our motor cortex can signal our bodies to do. If that doesn't work and you can't get out of the space, then your body says, all right, well, let's fight. When people say that they are not aggressive people and they have never actually gotten into a fight, that's not literally what it means. If your body is preparing to fight, so your adrenaline starts pumping, your muscles tighten, your heartbeat raises, your body is getting ready for an altercation. So this goes all the way back. These are our caveman bodies, our caveman brains that have natural responses to fear. And as we learned, trauma is a manifestation of the fear that we feel. So we try to fight either with words, we try to fight with our hands. If you are somebody who is aggressive, sometimes you try to fight with, again, aggressively trying to get out of the situation. So when that doesn't work, then the body goes into freeze. So freeze happens after the sympathetic nervous system says, I can't, nothing's working, we need to shut down. And that is when the parasympathetic nervous system takes over and you go into a withdrawal. So back when we were talking about stages of trauma recovery, this is the withdrawal phase that has two different parts. So there's a nerve in our body called the vagus nerve, and it runs from the top of our brain down to our stomach. And that people can relate to that a lot when they're talking about when they get nervous and they feel like they can't eat or they have anxiety and it affects their stomach. But it also affects everything from your brain down to your stomach. And there's two parts of that. So there's the unmyelinated sheath of the vagus nerve. And that is the part that teaches us to withdraw. It makes our bodies numb. We're not responding anymore to this because we just can't take it. That is the part that many people live in when they are experiencing trauma and they cannot escape. Then there's the myelinated sheath. And I always like to call it like the good part. The good part is that you can come out of this. You can come out of this trauma, you can come into recovery, but you need social interaction. Vagus nerves cannot be stimulated alone. People need people, literally. And so research in trauma specifically lets us know that we need each other to recover. Okay, next slide. So very specifically, the research I was talking about earlier, the adverse childhood experiences, talks about this. So again, the study was done in the Northwest in the 90s. It had 17,000 participants. These were all mostly white, middle-class people. So what they found is that over 4% of these people had at least one adverse childhood experience. So with that number, you can kind of correlate the fact that if that is what that percentage of middle-class white insured people have, the amount of ACE scores that a Black person might have, considering all of the racial trauma aspects or exposure that we just went through. And what that study showed was that there was a direct correlation between trauma as a child leading to problems as an adult, with depression, substance use, mental illness, relationship issues, heart disease, unhealthy risk behavior like promiscuity, and criminal behavior. Again, that's a whole other science, but absolutely. So if we know that to be true, and ACEs is a science that is becoming, thankfully, more and more well known and talked about when people talk about trauma-informed care, trauma-informed schools, it's acknowledging that people have had trauma in their life, and if we don't do something about it, they are more likely to have these problems later in life. And these are people in our society. So we can help them when they're children, then we can actually improve our outcomes as a society later on in life. Okay, next slide. So this is why we have to talk about this. We have to give people the vocabulary and the language to continue to talk about racism and racial trauma. In the Black culture, we have been taught that silence is survival. Keep your head down and keep your mouth closed, and that is how you survive at work, at school, when you walk to the store. And it's really interesting because this whole reality of Black people living in suburbia is not, it's not necessarily been around for that long of a time. So it wasn't until after redlining was, I want to talk more about white flight and this white flight happening where people started leaving the cities, and then it became a very white thing to go into the suburbs and buy, because it used to just be the city and the country, and that's it. When suburbs started to be developed, they were very much only sold to white people. So having Black people now in the suburbs and having, I don't want to say a forced interaction, but having this new binding society is a reason why we need to continue to have these conversations, because the reality is here that we all do need each other and we all want to move forward as a society. And silence is not working for anybody anymore. We have to be able to have these conversations. Okay, next slide. So what does this look like? So for young people, and again, this comes from the Impact of Racial Trauma article, where a lot of studies were done and observations were done of young people who experienced racial trauma. And we're talking again about people who are mostly stuck in that fight or freeze, withdrawal phase of trauma. So they're going to have these manifest fears. They're going to have, may have aggression. A lot of times it results in depression and anxiety. Again, talking about the low self-image, when we're talking about the image of Black people in this country and how young people often need to be intentionally taught not to feel that way about themselves. That's why there's books out there for young people talking about how beautiful their hair is and how golden their skin is, because we have to teach them that they are not ugly or violent or stupid. Shame is another feeling that's associated with racial trauma. And that can come from a variety of different things, but more specifically, shame can be associated with the fact with a lot of self-hate also. And I don't want to say hypervigilance is, I guess, not my favorite. I want to say, to me, it's one of the most prevalent that I see in young people is the hypervigilance. It's not about being oversensitive. It is about protecting yourself against racism, when people often do call out things when they see it. And when you're a person of color calling out racism, a lot of times it does not end well. And so that's why we need allies. We need people to validate our experiences, and we need people to stand with us. And I know what racism is and know when to call it out, because when we're the only ones saying it, it becomes exhausting. And then it becomes things like people being too sensitive. So hypervigilance is a really important symptomology that I would like to point out. And of course, with all this going on, it's natural to become pessimistic, especially when we're talking about things like spatial racism. So here, I know a lot of you guys are in Virginia. So here we're having meetings about removing Confederate monuments. And to hear people argue against the removal of Confederate arguments, that itself is traumatizing. How are you going to tell me how it makes me feel? So it can definitely breed some pessimism when you're constantly fighting. So any kind of stress and trauma can then, of course, carry over to nightmares, which are going to lead to some difficulty concentrating. Substance use is something that people use to self-medicate. So if you are, again, in that position where your bodies are in that constant freeze zone and your bodies are saying, let's get numb, we can't deal with this anymore. Sometimes people turn to substances to make themselves feel better and aid that numbness. Flashbacks are known to occur in people who have experienced interpersonal, physical, or vicarious trauma. And of course, you have all this going on, you're going to have trouble with communication and even language. Very specifically, when your reticular activation system is stimulated, your brain that goes into that caveman part of your brain actually limits your ability to process language, both understanding it and producing it. It's very interesting science, but it's very true. And so when you're in any kind of height situation, in like an intimate relationship, it can become even more stimulating and difficult to function. Hyperactivity, heart disease, and headaches, all, again, some other physical symptoms that can manifest from racial trauma, just our biological responses. Okay, next slide. So resilience is the ability to recover from a traumatic experience. Can it be done? Yes. And I just have so much hope, this movement that's happening right now, to see all these allies. And actually, let's go to the next slide. So when I see all these allies, and I know that people cannot always, because of COVID or other reasons, even with safety concerns, participate in activism. But even just seeing and knowing and watching allies can build up someone's sense of belonging. So what you see in front of you is a medicine wheel. At Reset, we kind of use this as our tool of resilience and recovery. It's a Native American concept that talks about how a broken person becomes whole. And that is by building their mastery, generosity, independence, and belonging. And I use this model when I'm talking about racial trauma, because if you are Black in this country or Indigenous in this country, and the country is not where it needs to be to optimize healing, we as individuals still can make a huge impact on people who are experiencing racial trauma. So these are just some ideas that I put up there, and of course the list continues to go on, but some things that would encourage mastery specifically are things like educating yourself on Black history, educating yourself on current policies, and people who are fighting to encourage inclusive policies can be incredibly important when you're talking about mastering your experience. Having conversations like we're having today, conversations with other people that you trust that are like-minded are really important. Watching movies, reading books, and of course, practicing mindfulness. When the whole world around you is rocking like a boat, if you can, for 20 minutes a day, concentrate on what you can control, and that's your breathing and your mind, then it's going to make you even more productive when we're talking about moving forward and healing yourself. Generosity. So there's been many times, and I think if anyone's experienced this, when you go out to help somebody with something, and then you walk away feeling better about yourself. Generosity helps build people to become whole. And I put things on there like making signs. You don't have to go on a march, but you can make a sign that screams something that you want to say and put it up in your window, put it up in your car, put it up in your room. It doesn't have to be, you definitely don't have to put yourself in any type of perceived danger to do this. Because a lot of times that's what people want to do. They don't understand something and they're angry about something and they want to scream. And so making signs can be really therapeutic. Sending cards to people, again, maybe with those words that you want to say. And I put there holding doors and saying thank you. And, it's interesting how very simple things that we do can have a big effect on people. So even in my own experience, I have been walking in my neighborhood before the murder of George Floyd. But since these riots have happening, I kid you not, people have stopped and said hi to me. I've even had white people stop me and say, I just want you to be safe, Black Lives Matter. And that makes me feel amazing. And I make sure to say thank you to them. I do go to some, and my sign says, thank you, allies, because it is an amazing feeling. And so we can return that generosity by saying thank you for being here. So belonging, talked a little bit about that already, but belonging in a safe space. So again, the value of family, the power and value of peer groups, affinity groups, and I put in there hugs. And of course, I'm talking about hugging people in your household. Don't go around hugging people. But hugging has a huge, powerful effect on making people feel safe and that they belong. And so it's so important to remember that, because we can get so caught up with what we're doing that we forget to hug our babies. And to build the resilience factor of independence, kids can join things like join peer groups, where sometimes they are activist groups and sometimes there's groups that want to talk. I cannot emphasize enough the power of storytelling, that ability to capture your story, to spread your story, to own your story. Because when we're talking about trauma and we're talking about those recovery steps, being able to tell your story brings you into that awareness, brings you into that activism part that helps you heal. Watching award shows where people of color are acknowledged for their work, not just in music, but in their work in art, in literature, and science, is really, really impactful. And I can't begin to tell you about the music in the Mexican American culture. It is such a powerful tool, and something that, for the most part, people can be really proud of, because that has been our storytelling tool for decades, if not even longer. So something I really want to point out is that even though racial trauma is so prevalent and it's so impactful, we can do things, and we are doing things to reverse the effects of that and to help people recover. Okay, I think that's the last slide, and I'm still ran late.
Well, thank you so much, Monica. That was, I mean, I think I can speak for all of us when I say that was amazing. I know I already learned so much. I did want to open the floor to anybody that wants to ask questions. I think earlier in the chat, somebody asked a question.
Yeah,
yes.
So I see that.
Yeah.
How do we protect people, to include children, from being re-traumatized when there is a racial incident that they are involved in, that goes viral on the news and or social media? Is there a way to prepare for that? That is, something. So even after the video of George Floyd occurred, there's been several other things that were kind of viral on social media, including the most recent recording of Elijah McClain's, the body cam recording of his voice right before his murder. And the only thing that I could say that could help prepare someone for that, because we can't avoid it, if 95% of children between the ages of 10 and 17 have cell phones. 95% between the ages of 10 and 17. So even with any kind of parent block, it's really hard to avoid access to that type of social media. So the biggest thing that you can do to prepare for that is to talk about whether or not it's right or wrong. Know that if it's too much, and I have these conversations with my kids too. If you come across something on that screen and you feel you have to have, and this is the power of mindfulness too. So if you feel that your body is reacting in a certain way and you're becoming emotional, you have to have the ability to turn it off. And if that doesn't occur, then as soon as you're done seeing that, let's talk about it. Let's process it. What happened? How did it make you feel? What can we do now about that? Somebody wants to ask a question verbally. Thanks, Star. Can they unmic? No, I don't know if you can unmic, so you might have to.
I can. Okay.
Oh,
Now
okay.
all right. So what I wanted to ask was, so the one thing that I don't like about the public education system is that the way that it conveys history surrounding African Americans is so limited in like what it tries to convey. It almost feels like a non sequitur, because the way that I learned it in AP US history last year was we talk about issues like slavery and all that, but the stopping point for African American history is the end of the civil rights movement. But
Right.
African American history extends beyond that as well. So what I wanted to ask was, how can public education be used as a bipartisan way to help educate children, not just like Black children, but all children, in addressing racial, or like teaching racial issues that are facing some of their classmates and stuff like that?
So that's a wonderful question, and it comes twofold. Number one, yes, there's more history than they teach in school right now in basic literature classes, basic English classes, basic social studies classes. But even more important to that is the history of African people. I think is really important too to involve in there. And the only thing I can tell you is that it has to come from the top down. So really contacting people in your state Department of Education is really the best way to get changes like that made. I know specifically in Virginia, there is a whole committee right now that's reviewing curriculum, specifically to our 4th and 11th graders about American history. But in addition to that, there's other things that we can do outside of school to educate kids. We have to take, especially opportunities like this, to have these conversations, to teach about Black history, to teach about other people besides Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. There's at least, there's hundreds of thousands of other Black Americans that we can be learning about. But also, I really want to point out the fact that the interpersonalization of thinking that people were brought here as enslaved people to kind of, and that this is the benefit to them. They moved here because they got brought out of a place where there was no food and no water and they lived in grass huts, is a myth. And so I do think that a lot of times we also need to make sure that not just our Black children, you're absolutely right, but not just our Black children, but everyone is educated on the history of Africa as well, to know that these are not slaves they brought over. These were people that they brought over and enslaved. So that kind of language too. And also some English teachers that I have met in schools have been absolutely amazing with incorporating a lot of literature, because they do have a lot of leniency in that aspect. So if you have anybody if you have kids in school or teachers, you can ask them, hey, have you thought about talking about this book? Have you thought about highlighting this author? Is just a really good way, a small way to get in there, but really big change has to come from our state departments of education. Either way, have folks in this meeting can say contact you. So yes, absolutely. So reset now, but you can go to that website. You can sign up to be. You can sign up there. We have newsletters going out. We have some campaigns that we're actually starting on now. So you can learn all about that on the website, and also you can reach me through the website as well, or you can send an email to info@resetnow.org. What is the best way to approach the discussion and be proactive? So if I'm reading that correctly, she's almost 5, and I got to tell you, books, there are so many books out there that help people talk about race. And even if you went onto Amazon, children's books about race, because I think there's nothing, so we in the therapeutic world, we call that bibliotherapy. But we really just open up a book and we read the book and then we talk about it. I think it's really the best way to reach young people right now, is to have these conversations, but not just from us, but from understanding that it's bigger than us. It's bigger than what mommy thinks or what daddy thinks. This is what's going on in the world around us. How can we support Reset? So it's a nonprofit. If you go onto the website, there's a donate button right on the front page. If you are able to donate, you will get an EIN number and a receipt via email, and all donations, of course, are tax deductible. So yes, for any more information on Reset, definitely just go to the website. There's a lot of information on there. Well, that's all the questions. I really want to say thank you for everybody.
I had a question though. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, Monica, first of all, this was very, very informative, especially as an African-American woman. You gave a lot of information of things that I haven't even heard of, in forms of trauma and things like that. My question for you, and I am an educator as well, an English teacher, and I have taken it upon myself to expose my students to more literature and to more things outside of Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King.
Awesome.
But, yes, but you twofold question. You mentioned something about having a vocabulary and a language when you're speaking to people about racial trauma, about African Americans, about having that conversation. Where can I get that information? Because that's true. How can we have the conversation if I'm not equipped with the language or the vocabulary? Because I think that's where we stop, where we can't have it, because some of us don't know how to speak it. So where can I find the information about starting the talk, knowing the right ways, the right words to say? Do you understand what I'm saying or no?
I understand exactly what you're saying.
Okay.
And so when I talked about just some of the definitions in this presentation, that's kind of the language that I was talking about, so people can identify what type of trauma they're experiencing and how they experienced it. So like right now, I feel like I'm being gaslighted because when I was at work, this happened. But actually what you're saying is very specific, and I definitely am going to keep that in mind as something that I may want to put out there as how do we start these conversations. Yeah. And it's interesting because it's different how we have these conversations with our children versus our coworkers versus our friends. So there are definitely, but the vocabulary specifically that I'm talking about is the vocabulary of racism, racial trauma, what it is, and what happened to you. Does that make sense?
It does. So because as I said before, a lot of information you gave to me is new and it's exciting, but it's also esoteric. It's like, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm like, this is, and I just became the equity leader at my school. So this language is awesome, but I'm like, I'm overwhelmed myself. I'm interested, but I'm like, wow, this is so much and this is great. But where do I go to make this more, put it in layman's terms? Because everything you said was awesome, but I needed to be in layman's terms so that I understand it, so I can translate it to other people. Because what you said was phenomenal.
Yes. So the very beginning is tell me your story. And you don't have to put any words in there that you don't understand. Tell me your story. Write it down. Take 5 minutes out of your life. Tell me here's a great opening question. A great opening question is, what is the first time you became aware of your race? And that could be asked to white people, to Black people. When is the first time you became aware of your race? That gets the mind going to understand how race is perceived to that person. And that's a really good starting question. And then coming at that makes people have a different type of mindset, a foundation almost, and then they can tell you their story. And then when you start to hear about what impacted them and how it impacted them, then you can help kind of look at that situation and say, well, what could have been done differently?
Thank you.
What can be done now to support that person?
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Nona, that is, I hate to use this term, Bible books, but that is a really good book, How to Be Anti-Racist. And he actually now, thankfully, because of all of these online events, he is doing a lot of events online to talk about being anti-racist. So he definitely recommend that book. And I don't even know where that comment. I think that was it. Yes, there it is. Ibram Kennedy, wonderful one. And he actually lives in D.C. And so hopefully, after some of the lockdown is over, he actually might be starting, or he is starting an institute for the study of anti-racism. That's not the exact name of it, but he's beginning a study institute in Washington D.C. Where he's going to be researching policy, overturning racist policies, at least locally, and then hopefully nationally. So he is an amazing advocate. So definitely, if you have time, watch him and read his books, watch his YouTube. He's amazing.
All right, if we don't have any other remaining questions, I'm going to go ahead and close. Feel free if anyone does have any last minute questions to go ahead. But until then, I just wanted to thank you so much for being here, Monica. I also wanted to give everybody a refresher. Miss Monica's organization Reset, all of the the website and the socials are on the screen right now, as well as our socials, and you can sign up for our Remind if you want to get updates for future speakers going forward. And again, thank you so much. The video of this session is going to be uploaded to our YouTube channel by the end of the week, so feel free to watch it again or share it with others who may have missed out, or to anyone who you know could need the education, because we definitely need a lot of that, especially right now. Lastly, if we can switch to the next slide, I encourage everyone here to visit one of these websites, sign a few petitions, call or email a politician, make a donation. It's a lot of the little stuff that counts and that matters. So there are ways to get involved, as small as it may seem. It's all important. So I encourage you guys to check that out. I encourage you guys to check out Monica on her socials. And once again, thank you so much for coming, Monica. We absolutely loved having you. Thank you to everyone else for listening. Make sure you keep up with us to see what's happening going forward. And yeah, thank you everybody for coming.